Welcome back. You are listening to the Labor Forum here on WRFG 89.3 FM. And we've just concluded a really interesting interview with two members of IATSE. That's the stagehands union here in the city. And again, many of you go to concerts and go to different events where the results of their work is before you. Okay, we're now going to turn to another good discussion. This past week, there was a big conference here in Atlanta, and it was, I'm really sorry that I don't remember the exact name of the organization, but it was hundreds and hundreds
Society
of people. Can you tell me what it is?
The Society for Disability Studies.
I knew that. Anyway, they had a big conference that was down at the Hyatt. On Saturday, there was actually, it was called a parade. It was a big march that went to Centennial Olympic Park for sort of like a celebration and a rally. And the celebration part is that this July marks the 50th year since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I want to say that I think that this is something now that many people really don't have too much, maybe even memory of what it was like prior to the ADA, nor do they have any knowledge of the intense and immense struggle that disabled folks put up to get that act passed. And so we want to first start with Danny, who will give us some little background about the ADA.
So the ADA was groundbreaking. It's still groundbreaking. You know, when it came out in 1990, it really helped set up legislation that would help break down barriers for people with disabilities. And you can see the barriers listed pretty clearly in the 5 titles of the ADA. So there's employment, there's housing, I'm sorry, there's not housing. There's employment, public accommodations, private accommodations, and these cover broad areas like transportation. It allows for paratransit if there's a fixed route service. It allows for service animals to be present with their owners in businesses. So, one of the big things was employment. One of the biggest barriers while this was in committee and they were receiving testimonies, one of the barriers that came up again and again and again was employment. People with disabilities face high levels of unemployment, high levels of poverty, because at the time they could be denied a job with nothing. I mean, there was no recourse for us to pursue further things. There weren't any, there was the Rehabilitation Act, which laid some of the groundwork, and then the ADA kind of helped reinforce that. It reinforced other legislations like the Assistive Technology Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act to make sure that we could be on the same footing as everybody else. So the employment part, again, was huge because now you could not be asked about your disability ahead of time. Your employer couldn't use the disability as grounds to dismiss you as a viable candidate. In the Title I employment, it does state specifically that qualified individuals with disabilities need to be considered on the same grounds, and that's when reasonable accommodation comes into the picture. Reasonable accommodation is something like if you're blind, having a screen reader, having an alternate form of accessing print. If you're deaf, having ways of compensating or kind of working in the environment. So, it could include a change of schedule. There's a lot of different areas that are reasonable, and it's something that isn't going to cause an undue burden on the company. A lot of people think accommodations are expensive or they're hard to do, and they're really not.
Let me just interrupt. I realize I didn't introduce you to. So let me, folks. Okay, so I was so excited to get into the conversation, I forgot to tell our listeners who's here. So we have 2 members of Disability Link. And we have Ken Mitchell here, and Ken has been here before, particularly talking about the questions of MARTA and the mobility vans and the transportation for disabled folks. But this is a new guest. We have Danny Housley here, and he's also with Disability Link. So now that I've introduced you two, we'll start again. Ken, did you want to make a comment on anything, or should I go to Paul, because I see he has a question?
Paul has a question, go ahead, Paul.
Well, Ken, what I was going to follow up in terms of your work with veterans, what's the relationship there between employment and disability as far as veterans are concerned?
Well, veterans is just another group of people with disabilities that use the Americans with Disabilities Act as a key or access to working conditions. I guess it's about the same for all people with disabilities. Veterans maybe have a different avenue or venue to use that non-veterans would not, and of course that would be the Veterans Administration. But it's the same for all people with disabilities. We're using all different labels. And I kind of think of the American Disabilities Act as, like Danny was just talking about, as kind of an access to work. It's like a window. It kind of shows a light on the different barriers that are in the way of people with disabilities of getting work.
Can you say a little bit, and I know just from my learning about the disability rights movement that it borrowed a lot of its inspiration from the civil rights movement. Can you say a little bit about that? How they're similar?
Oh, similar in a number of ways. The disability rights movement takes a lot of its structure and procedures from the civil rights movement, except for maybe the only thing that it might not use is having like maybe a single leader or figure. The civil rights movement had had single leaders like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Cleaver or someone like that. Whereas the disability rights movement, the disability rights movement doesn't necessarily have a single leader because once that leader kind of fades away, some of the movement kind of slows down a little bit.
So I went to part of the conference. I also went on the march or the parade that took place on Saturday, and I went through this, I guess it's like it was a museum. It was the bus. And I understand that all of that material will be digitally available later in July, but it was quite eye-opening. There was a whole lot of information about the number of disabled people who are under the poverty line, the number of disabled people who are unemployed. And I was wondering if either one of you has any of that information, because again, as I said, when you look at what the so-called disabled community is, it is a whole range of people, from people born with a disability who then have to go through an educational process, and we're going to talk about graduation rates for children, youth with disabilities. Then there's all the people who become disabled through the course of their job. There's people who become disabled from car accidents and all kinds of other things. And then now you talked about veterans, literally thousands of veterans coming back with physical and mental disabilities. And then you have people getting older who also can fall under this category. So this is like a huge, not just not growing population. This is a population that is growing a lot. So I wanted both of you, after you can give us these statistics if you have them, to also talk about, you've mentioned the good things about the ADA, but let's talk about where it still needs to go.
So when we talk about really the only firm numbers that I have with me right now are the unemployment rate and how high it is. If you look, it's usually between 65 and 70% of people with disabilities face unemployment, and there are a number of factors for that. I mean, there's still discrimination in the workplace as far as the hiring process goes. I've faced it. I know many other people have faced that kind of discrimination. And the other thing too is access to Medicaid. People that have significant disabilities having access to healthcare and having access to the services that they're going to need, especially if you have something like, say, multiple sclerosis, which is progressive, then as time goes on, you're going to need additional supports, and those supports are often expensive, and people need Medicaid. And a lot of people that, one of the requirements of Medicaid will say, well, can you work? And a lot of folks from an early age will have to try to prove that they're unable to work in order to
get the medical care.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of restrictions when you do get Medicaid. Like, if you do work, you can only work so much. You can only earn so much. You can't plan for retirement. There's a lot of problems with the system that's set up. So I'll let Ken.
That's good. That's good. When people talk about people with disabilities, we know that, forgive me on numbers, about almost 13% of the population are people with disabilities right now. And one of my phrases that I got from my friend Linda Pogue, I kind of summed it up. It says, if you're lucky enough to live long enough, you will become a person with a disability. And it's kind of a fact that we know that if we hang in there long enough, we'll be lucky enough to become a person with disabilities. Now, some of us, like myself, may have come in a little bit earlier in life than others, but lucky enough that will happen.
Well, now, we've had also on this program workers, home health care workers. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about the connection between improving the training, the conditions, the pay for home health care workers, and how that would benefit all these variety of folks who need different kinds of care, from whether it's just helping with getting their medication or, house cleaning or, much more serious services. Could either one of you comment on that, about the relationship between the workers who provide some care for disabled folks and your struggle for more rights as well?
I'll start off, if this is okay. We're put into a kind of a catch-22 when we come about workers with supporting people with disabilities. One, we know that with the right supports, people with disabilities can do anything that anyone else can do. And so we want them to have those supports. Unfortunately, with a limited number of funds, let's say myself would only have a certain amount of dollars that we can use. So I may need support for 24 hours, let's just say. I guess that's the most support you can get. And so we want to, of course, pay our workers equal amount, sufficient amount for those 24 hours. But what winds up happening is that the funding doesn't support them for maybe, let's say, 12 hours. But I still need that support for 24. So the issue is, how do we get our workers and caregivers to have the right amount of support financially to support people with disabilities, so they can support themselves and be taxpayers for everybody. And so that's what I guess our conundrum is. Comments, anybody else?
Well, it's obviously something that we have to figure out, because I know that there's the National Domestic Workers Alliance has been working on this issue. ADAPT has been working on this issue in coalition in other parts of the country, and I'm hoping that we can do something like that here, and so we can set up a situation where everybody wins, where people in the disability community are empowered to live productive lives, and home care workers can make a living wage so that they can sustain their families and have pensions too. So that's something that I hope that we can, certainly that we're talking about here, is how do we bring that about.
I just want to say, it seems to me that this is this kind of age-old tactic of the boss, which is to try to pit one group of people and workers against another group of people and workers, so that if one wins, the other one has to lose. And it seems
that the pie is only so big.
Yeah, and the pie is only so big, and there's not enough to go around. And so it seems to me that the real lesson here is as Paul said, is to figure out how it is that combined together the push can be forward to, in other words, allow and grant livable wages to home care workers, better training, better really able to cope and deal and support disabled people, and on the other hand, for disabled people to have absolutely more rights to decent jobs and living wages. So I want to get to the sub-minimum wage. I don't think many people know that there's actually, it's legal to pay a disabled worker even less than the lousy minimum wage that already is not a living wage. Could either one of you address how that came about and who gets to do that?
This is a topic that every time I mention it to somebody, they are surprised. Because they say, well, there's a minimum wage. I'm like, there's a minimum wage for some people, but not for others. And it is part of the Fair Labor, oddly, it's part of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Section 14C does have an allowance for organizations to apply for a certificate to pay workers with disabilities less than minimum wage.
Could you say what that is likely to be? I mean, okay, so $5.25 is the state minimum wage in Georgia, $7.25 is the federal. What would be a sub-minimum wage?
24 cents an hour.
24 cents an hour, folks. If you're driving, don't drive off the road. 24 cents an hour.
I mean,
Talk about it.
It varies. It varies from company to company, but you know, some of the organizations that have delved into this and kind of done some more research, they found 24 cents an hour. In Georgia, there was a certain organization paying $1.25 an hour, I think, to an employee whose only disability was that she was deaf. So it depends on the organization and what they choose to pay the individual. Sometimes it's a workshop environment, so you're being paid per piece.
Like piecework.
Mm-hmm. So that's, you know, again, that's when you look at it per hour, you're making a few dollars. But it's you know, it's one of those things that a lot of organizations have been advocating for fair wages. I know every year the National Federation of the Blind offers up legislation that would help even the playing field and get a true minimum wage for workers with disabilities and workers without. But it's something that gets shuffled around and never quite makes it to the floor for a vote.
So going back to Diane's question about the ADA has brought things this far, what could be improved on? What, if, in terms of a vision for legislation or policy, what would you like to see?
The ADA, you know, it's always changing. You know, the amendments that we've changed the definition of disability. Well, not changed it. We changed the wording of disabilities and not use labels as much and use actual characteristics for disability. Working on what is actually reasonable accommodations. Working on what support measures are. And basically, it's for me, is the same thing that our Constitution states in its preamble. Just what you have certain rights, and the rights are the same for everybody. So we want to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights as everyone else.
One of the things that was raised at this rally on Saturday was the Olmstead decision. And people, again, may not, there's such a lack of knowledge about the impact, frankly, of Georgia on so many different kinds of big things, whether it's gay rights or or the death penalty or whatever. So can somebody talk about that? Because this seems to me to have been a major step in the change from institutionalizing disabled people.
Yeah. Olmstead it's huge. It is huge because it was the first time that the ADA had been challenged in front of the Supreme Court. And if things had gone the wrong way, then you wouldn't see as many people with disabilities living in the communities of their choosing today. Olmstead came about because of two women who did not want to live in an institution. They had various disabilities. Some of the most stigmatized, they had some mental health, among others. But when you have a mental health related disability, that is one of the most stigmatized disabilities. And even when they were looking at passing the ADA, you had a lot of organizations that were lobbying for mental health and for people with AIDS to be excluded from protections of the ADA. So, you know, these two women, Lois Curtis and Elaine, I forgot her first name.
We
They-
used to say LC.
They decided they did not want to be in an institution. They got in touch with Atlanta Legal Aid, and of course, you know, it went through the court system all the way up to the Supreme Court, where it was decided that people with disabilities have the option to live in the least restrictive environment, which excludes institutions because they are one of the most restrictive environments. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to look at what is really relatively recent about the conditions that existed in mental institutions and a variety of other so-called institutions where disabled folks of different kinds were placed.
In Milledgeville, for example.
So they were true hellholes. There's no other way to describe it. They were torture centers in so many ways with. And so when we look now, and again, it's a big improvement, very clearly a big improvement. But I think still we see, and I'm going to raise a whole nother issue, and that's about the Black Lives Matter movement and the issue of police brutality. And I want both of you to comment on this, I don't want to say epidemic, but it just seems to me that in the last several months, there have been so many people with mental issues that the police have killed because they apparently didn't quite understand the behavior, including here in Atlanta, where Anthony Hill was murdered by a cop, even though he was naked and crawling on the cement of a parking lot. Nevertheless, he was shot dead as a threat. So there have been other instances of that. I was wondering if either one of you would like to comment just on the relationship between police and anybody with a disability.
I think that, you know, it's a good way of tying everything back around. When we started out, we talked about the Americans with Disabilities Act and attitudes. And attitudes kind of cover a wide variety of things. One, the attitude is about educating people. It's about exposing people to different situations. You were talking a little bit about the Olmstead Act, Danny, and you were talking, and one of the things we have to remember is that the Olmstead decision, I'm sorry, this is an Olmstead decision, that LC is right here, it started right here in Georgia, and it changed it for the nation, and actually for the world, so it's to live in the most restrictive, least restrictive environment. And the institutions, even though we think of mostly institutions as hospitals, where we need to put, we'll just say Ken, because that's me, put him away to be away from the public. It wasn't that long ago that me, a blind person, would be right there in that institution and not here on the radio station giving you guys a hard time. So when you think about that, and when I think about that, we want to make sure that the ADA lets people kind of have a little bit of change in attitudes. And going back to the policeman, just because something's happening or visually happening does not mean that that is necessarily a threat or whatever. With a little bit more of education, a little bit more exposure, then perhaps some of those things would not happen.
I think a lot of police don't receive training in how to work with someone with a disability. It was just a year ago that a young man was choked to death in a movie theater in Baltimore. He had Down syndrome. His attendant had gone to get the car, and he really wanted to see this movie again, and things escalated. The usher called security. They were on top of the guy. He couldn't breathe, and he died because of that. And the attendant is telling him to get off. He can't breathe. He has issues with the throat. Weren't listening. People that are deaf. You can't hear somebody telling you what to do,
Yeah, stop.
then you get shot and killed because you didn't hear. There was an issue in Arkansas just last week of a blind man who was walking down the street, and the police were giving a verbal cue, but he didn't know that they were talking to him, and they ended up beating him in the street and claiming that his talking watch was potentially a weapon. So these are issues that are easily resolved if you get proper training. If you actually work and know, okay, here's how I work with somebody with a physical disability. If I'm going to arrest or alert them to my presence, you have to know how to make yourself known in an understandable and accessible way. And I don't think a lot of police get that type of training.
The time has gone by.
Already?
Yes, already. I am so thankful that the two of you were able to come in today. So listeners, this was Danny Housley and Ken Mitchell from Disability Link. Can one of you in like 10 seconds tell people how to get a hold of your organization if they want more information?
Yeah, you can visit us on the web at www.disabilitylink.org, find us on Twitter at DisabilityLink, and find us on Facebook at facebook.com/disabilitylink.
Disability Link, keywords. All right,
One word.
One word. Thank you so very much. Listeners, please do tune in again next Monday. And of course, we have a website, wrfglaborforum.org. Please go there, fill out our survey. This is important. And we want to thank you all for listening today. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Ken. And Jesse, the dog.
Yeah, oh, he's here too. I forgot to introduce him.